Island of Shipwrecks.
The bold and rugged coast next demanded our attention, as even at a league's distance it seemed to threaten us with approaching ruin. In some places it sunk into deep and gloomy caverns, and in others was overhung with frowning precipices, while the solitary screeches of the sea mews united with the wildness of the scenery to fill the mind with an awful melancholy.
The impressions of David Robertson, revisiting in 1791 the island that he knew well from his earlier service here as a customs officer, and his description of the wreck of the herring fleet in September 1787 captures the devastating impact of this event on a small, close-knit community.
Douglas Bay is spacious, and the neighbouring highlands render it an asylum from the tempests of the north, west and south. But to the storms of the east it is greatly exposed. Both points present a dangerous and rocky shore. The entrance of the harbour is narrow and dangerous, being fenced on either side by a range of precipices. In the centre of these a lighthouse, at once useful and ornamental, formerly stood. This, with a great part of the quay, was destroyed by a severe storm in 1786, and in this ruinous state, highly injurious to the public, and fatal to many individuals, it has remained ever since. To enumerate the various shipwrecks this neglect has occasioned would be unnecessary, but the awful calamity which happened in September 1787 is too interesting to be passed over in silence. I was then in Douglas, and never before witnessed such a scene of horror. The preceding day was delightfully serene, the sky pure and unclouded, and the sun shone forth in all his strength and beauty. In the morning about 400 fisher boats appeared in the bay and harbour, deeply laden with herrings to the amount of £5,000. Gladness smiled in every eye, and the song of mirth gave new energy to labour. The earlier part of the day was passed in unlading the boats, and the remainder devoted to festivity. The herring ground was then off Clayhead and Laxey, about 3 leagues from Douglas. In the evening, when the boats again sailed thither, there were no indications of a change in the weather. But at midnight, a brisk equinoctial gale arose, and the fishermen, impelled by their usual timidity, fled to the harbour of Douglas for refuge. On the ruins of the lighthouse is fixed a slender post, from which is hung a small lantern. This wretched substitute was thrown down by one of the first boats in its eagerness to gain the harbour. The consequences were dreadful. In a few minutes all was horror and confusion. The darkness of the night, the raging of the sea, the vessels dashing against the rocks, the cries of the fishermen perishing in the waves, and the shrieks of the women ashore imparted such a sensation of horror as none but a spectator can possibly conceive. When the morning came, it presented an awful spectacle. The beach and rocks covered with wrecks, and a group of dead bodies floating in the harbour. In some boats, whole families perished. The shore was crowded with women, some in all the frantic agony of grief, alternately weeping over the corpses of father, brother, and husband, and others sinking in the embrace of those whom a moment before they imagined were buried in the waves.
But if the wreck of the herring fleet is by far the most emotionally charged of Manx shipwrecks, it still is only one of thousands which must have taken place around our shores from Viking times and even earlier. I asked Anne Harrison, librarian and archivist of the Manx Museum, how far back the records really did go.
I've been able to find you the first wreck in 1418.
That's a long way back.
Yes, it's 600 years almost.
So, what kind of ship was it, and what were the circumstances?
Well, it's not awfully clear, but I'll read it, shall I? An inquisition taken at the court upon the oath of John MacPhillips, etc., 12 men of the jury, who say that Thomas Bell feloniously stole and carried away a timber thrown up close to the sea as a wreck below Scarlet, and drew the said timber to his own house.
So we don't know anything about the vessel, but we do know that a little bit of scavenging was going on in those
That's right.
days.
And of course it was against the law because the right of wreck belonged to the Lord of Man.
And is this in official records?
Yes, this is in the first sheeting roll of the Isle of Man that is still extant from the Derby period.
So, going on from the 15th century, have we anything at all then between that and the wreck of the herring fleet?
Well, the records have probably got quite a lot of secrets to unfold to us, but they're not catalogued or calendared. But what we do have, of course, the next source is the parish register. And, of course, when people are found dead, drowned, an entry is made, they have to be buried, and if you're lucky, you get quite a bit of information about the circumstances under which they died.
So, where do our parish registers take us to then?
The 1418 wreck was at Scarlet, and that, of course, is a very difficult coastline, and that's where there was an awful lot of disaster, I think, in over the years. Because if you look at the parish registers for Maloo, there's quite a succession of wrecks, and there was a vicar who liked to write, and he wrote a lot of information about each one. The registers start in 1649, and the first note of a wreck is in 1650.
Can we hear that then?
Yeah. John Miller, his bark, was broken upon the rocks at the Stack of Scarlet the 18th of April, after nightfall. Himself, 2 men and a boy were alive, but John Crostick, Michael Dennis, Nathaniel Grayson, infant, 2 young women, and a young man, a smith, whose names I could not learn, died, and were buried the 20th of April at the lower stile of the churchyard.
So that must have been a vessel of some size to have so many people on board.
Yes, well, a bark, I think, is quite a big ship, and it had women, perhaps related to the crew, the captain. Yes, it's quite a big crew. Quite a lot of people died. Yes, it's a big wreck.
Well, that's the parish registers. Have you anything else of a similar nature?
I mentioned that the first wreck was in the court roll. That's because the right of wreck was cherished by the Lord. You do get, in the papers of the Dukes of Atholl, letters being written to the Duke telling him about wrecks where his precious rights have, not been able to be picked up. And in 1757, which is getting on into modern times, Governor Cochrane wrote to the Duke in March, telling him that a ship from Malaga bound for Dublin, which sought shelter at Douglas, was driven ashore at the entrance of the harbour and broke up within hail of the people on the shore. All on board were lost. What cargo came ashore was stolen by the country people or else by the guards sent to protect it. So he was having problems.
So we've got manorial rolls, parish registers, government records.
Yeah.
When did the newspapers start?
Well, the newspapers start on the Isle of Man in 1793, and then, of course, you do get systematically information about what goes on around the coast.
And so the newspapers told their stories. Some accounts were cryptic reminders of the dangers of seafaring life.
During the storm, on Tuesday afternoon, 26th of September, a dismasted sloop sank off Port Sodrock, about 2 miles to the southward of this harbour. The crew, in attempting to reach shore, all perished. A brown water spaniel swam ashore, on which was engraved John Cragg, Kilbride. Some pieces of the small boat came ashore, on which was the name Gleaner of Kilbride.
Others were fuller tales of the pathos of individual tragedies.
As the boat settled in the water, 2 of the seamen managed to swim away and found an upturned boat in the floating debris. Eventually, heavy sea turned the boat over and they climbed in. All day Wednesday they rowed, seeing several steamers, but none saw them. On Friday afternoon, Mr. Grace left his oar and lay down in the stern, saying that he could not pull any more. He said to O'Neill, "If I die, send my wife word." He never spoke again. When the King Orry took them aboard 25 miles from Douglas, Grace was dead.
While yet others hinted of horrors that might encompass anyone who ventured to sea.
The Orleans, Captain Thomas, 931 tons, carrying salt and flagstones to New Orleans, she ran aground and was wrecked on the southeast side of the Calf, between Thickhead and the Burrows cliffs on high rocks. Screams could be heard from stowaways as water rushed into the vessel. They could not be rescued as they were battened down. The hull was later seen to float out to sea.
One of the best documented of Manx shipwrecks is that of HMS Racehorse, lost on Langness in December 1822. Brian King has been involved in much of the underwater archaeology that has taken place on the wreck, but it was about the circumstances of her loss that he told me first.
She had been sent up from the south of England to go and tow the wreck of the Vigilant back, which had gone on Conister previously, and she had arrived off Holyhead and picked up the pilot and headed from there for the Isle of Man. At 5 o'clock she sighted the light on the calf, and the pilot and the sailing master were undecided at this stage how many points to steer to the northeast, and disagreed about it, and eventually more or less split the difference. However, at 5:20 they saw lights which they took to be the light of Douglas Pier Head, and assuming they were in Douglas Bay at this stage, all the sails were ordered to be taken down and the anchor ready to be dropped. And in the process of this, one of the lookouts spotted breakers, and before they knew what had happened, they were actually swept onto the Scranes Rock at Langness, which they had mistaken for Douglas, the bay, and the outgoing tide had swept them back onto the rocks. And it was at this stage, with the sea sort of going fairly heavily, in the sense there was a heavy swell. There wasn't a gale at this stage, but there was certainly reference to the beating up and down on the rocks, and there was great difficulty in launching the boats because of the heavy swell. 2 boats were stove in by the swell, and one of the cabin boys was drowned in the act of getting into one of them. 2 of the boats did get away eventually, though, the cutter and the galley, and they made to the shore, but there's no reference to them actually getting there and raising help, although the local inhabitants did arrive out at Langness, probably in response to the cannons being fired by the Racehorse itself.
There are one or two interesting points about that. First of all, the reference to the lights on the calf. Robert Stevenson's 2 lighthouses, still to be seen on the calf, were established only a few years before this occurred.
It's interesting that, in fact, they had the one light there for a bearing. They were obviously used to, or the pilot was used to, using this as a bearing point, but obviously the discrepancy in their sailing from then on led to the disaster.
Another point that strikes me is that the elapsed time between sighting the calf lights and assuming they were off Douglas suggests that they had only a rather rudimentary idea of what the distance was.
Yes, the time of 20 minutes. I mean, it would take a speedboat that long, a modern speedboat that long, to get from the calf to Castletown Bay. But it just says the reference was to lights. They saw lights, which they took to be Douglas Pier Head. Now, whether they were still some way off when they saw that at 5:20, we don't know. There's no actual reference to the exact time that she struck the rocks. Heading at the speed they were going, it may have been a while later, after seeing lights, before they got into the bay.
It suggests that there is, in fact, no light on Langness, and in fact the Langness Lighthouse was established by the Commissioners of Northern Lights as late as 1880. But what light then had they seen?
Well, from what was found out afterwards, a Captain Thompson had lived out at Scarlet House and had died shortly prior to the wrecking, and they were having a wake, and there were so many lights there that it was these lights which had misled the pilot to thinking he was in Douglas Bay.
The reference that you made earlier on to the cutter and the galley getting away, they took 40, 50 men away. What was the total complement of the Racehorse?
Just over 100 men, including some Marines who were on board.
So the state of the remaining 50-odd must have been a fairly dangerous one.
Yes, it must have been. There's no reference to actually where the 2 boats that did go away did land. However, it was at this stage, where the guns were being fired, that a local boat made its way out. Now, whether that was in response to the other boats getting to the shore or just the cannons being fired, we're not 100% sure.
This local boat, of course, made several trips.
Yes, it was 4 trips altogether, and the first 3 it made perfectly safely, and it refers to landing the survivors in a small gully. We're not quite sure where that is. It was on the fourth trip that the disaster occurred, when the local boat was overturned and 4 seamen with 3 of the gallant and humane natives were drowned. That is Captain Suckling's phraseology when writing to the Admiralty telling of the loss of the ship.
The loss of the racehorse plays a still more interesting role in the history of seafaring, because it was Sir William Hilary's efforts to gain pensions for the dependents of those 3 gallant and humane natives that led to his founding of the National Institution for the Preservation of Life from Shipwreck. Douglas received the institution's first lifeboat, and in it Hilary's feats of heroism earned him 3 of the institution's gold medals. Robert Kelly, Hilary's biographer, tells of one of these, the passenger vessel St. George.
The island had been served rather badly by a number of very poor paddlers which couldn't operate at all in the winter months. The Manx people had decided to have their own shipping line, the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company as it turned out to be, but the owners of the paddlers operating from Liverpool said that they would force the Manx Company out of business. The end result was a number of paddle ship races between Douglas and Liverpool, in which the Manx master, William Gill, proved himself to be the most superior of the 2 masters. Having beaten all the smaller vessels, the St. George Company brought its main vessel off the Dublin run, the St. George, to compete against the Manx vessels, and it was at the end of one of the races between the Manx vessel and the St. George that they were both in the bay when the storm developed, and the Manx vessel, Mr. Gill, obviously aware of the dangers in the bay, he got the Mona's Isle well away from Douglas Bay, preferring to face the storm out to sea than be anchored in close to the shore. Lieutenant Tudor, who was in charge of the St. George, was unaware of the conditions in Douglas Bay and rather preferred to stay close to shore until he saw the way conditions were going and found his anchor cable to be dragging. It finally snapped and the vessel was swept onto the rocks known as St. Mary's Isle in the bay.
The incident of the St. George in Douglas Bay was one of the occasions when Sir William Hilary was awarded the gold medal. What precisely did he do for that?
Well, one must remember first of all that the man was in his late 50s at the time and couldn't swim, and it was a severe storm. He persuaded others to go out with him in the lifeboat, and the intention was to approach close to the stricken vessel to persuade the crew to jump down onto the lifeboat. Getting too close, however, was nearly his undoing, because the vessel was caught in the surf around the rocks and swamped. Sir William was thrown overboard, and it's only by good chance that he survived, I suppose, because when he was under the water he managed to come across a rope which he grasped and hauled himself to safety. In that incident he suffered a couple of broken ribs and was hauled to safety on board the St. George. So he was on board for a couple of hours, and in that time everyone realized that the only hope of escape was in some clear water at the stern of the vessel. However, that escape route was blocked by some rigging and masts. They had to cut that away before they could escape. They then embarked the crew, 20 men from the St. George, plus the 14 lifeboat men, making 36 in all, on the one vessel. They had to lower themselves on ropes to her. They pushed off. Unfortunately, a large wave came across, and it was almost their undoing yet again, but it must have been a large one, for it carried the entire lifeboat across the rocks to the other calmer side and safety. Everybody was there. Nobody had been lost at all.
No doubt experiences like this gave Hilary a healthy respect for the dangers of Douglas Bay. However, as Robert Kelly tells us, the topography of the bay was not by any means as we know it today.
Much of Lower Douglas isn't built on land at all. It's reclaimed land, mainly on sand. In fact, as far back as Backstrom Street is sand if you just go a couple of inches down.
Collister Rock, or St Mary's Isle as it was known, although it seems quite close inshore now, was really quite a far out hazard in the bay.
Very remote, I suppose, at least half a mile out from any safety.
And vessels which were taking shelter in the bay or which were embayed in easterly winds were in particular danger from it.
Yes, the tendency was to cluster towards the Douglas Head side of the bay to shelter from the worst of the southeasterly gales, but of course if their anchor cable dragged or broke, they had no hope then. They were swept directly onto this rock.
And so one of the public-spirited works of Sir William Hillary was the erection of what came to be known as the Tower of Refuge.
Yes, the William Wordsworth, who had relatives on the island, visited the island in 1833 and gave it that name in a sonnet. It was built the previous year by funds raised by Sir William and his wife. It cost in all £254, of which he subscribed £78. Appropriately enough, in view of the fact that it was built only 2 years after the wreck of the St George, the foundation stone of the tower was laid on St George's Day in April 1832. That the tower was completed within that year, having been designed by John Welsh, the architect who also designed the Fort Anne.
Now, what precisely was the tower intended to afford?
Precisely what it says, a place of refuge where men could escape from their stricken craft and actually get inside, where there would be food in store, clothing, and also a bell which they could ring to hopefully rouse the population. It also had the added benefit of being a prominent landmark to warn mariners who weren't aware of the dangers, like Sir William Hillary, and hopefully prevent repetitions of so many wrecks as had happened in the past.
The harbour of the Port of Douglas might be made one of the best and safest harbours upon any coast, and at Port Iron there may be a harbour erected at no great expense that might shelter vessels of almost any burden from any storm. By the ruinous state of Douglas Harbour and the want of shelter at Port Iron, I am convinced that property to a great value and many useful lives are annually lost. Many losses must also be attributed to the want of lighthouses on the principal parts of this island, viz. the Calf of Man, Langley's Point near Castletown, Douglas Head, and the Point of Aids. Lights being erected at these places, the harbour of Douglas repaired and extended, and a proper harbour built at Port Iron, to which loss I understand the inhabitants of this island, as well as the traders of Whitehaven and Workington, etc., would cheerfully contribute. Great property and many valuable lives would yearly be saved to the British dominions.
Mr. Alexander Cook, writing in 1791 in evidence to the Harbour Commissioners investigating the needs of the island following the wreck of the herring fleet. But with open beaches, tidal river mouths and iron-bound cliffs, providing shelter has never been easy, a point developed by Chief Harbour Master Brian Kinley.
We're not as lucky as the likes of the Liffey or the Clyde, where the great dock systems can be constructed in relatively tranquil waters. And in the main, any sheltered water capable of accommodating craft of any size has had to be won by constructing piers extending into open water.
In order to achieve this, some of the best engineering brains of the 19th century addressed themselves to the problem of providing a harbour of refuge for the Irish Sea on either the west or the east coast of the Isle of Man.
Yes, that's correct. Sir William Hillary was pushing for quite some time in the 1830s to have a harbour of refuge built in the island. And because of his persistence, a Captain Denham proposed a slightly curved arm direct from Douglas Head, 1,900 feet long, with its extreme overlapping that of another arm direct from St. Michael's Rock, 1,400 feet long. Now this would have been a wonderful harbour, and it's a pity it was never gone ahead with, because as you know, Douglas Harbour has always been open to southeast gales, and in fact ships used to have to actually put to sea in southeast gales to seek shelter on the other side of the Isle of Man. Sir John Rennie, in the same year, he was brought in to look at what could be done to make a harbour of refuge, and his scheme was slightly less grandiose than Denham's. This again would have made a wonderful harbour, but again, because of cost, it was never proceeded with.
The ingenuity of harbour engineers knew no bounds, and the Floating Harbour of Refuge Company at one stage was brought in, again at Sir William Hillary's instigation, to provide a floating breakwater. What would you think to that, Brian?
Well, not a lot, I don't think. Anything that was floating and needed to be moored to the seabed was very suspect.
If we look at the history of some of the harbour works, Port Erin Breakwater, for instance, and the original Abernethy design at Douglas, these very heavy onshore winds were forces of destruction.
Yes, indeed. The Abernethy Pier at Douglas, which extended out in the direction of the present Battery Pier, although it didn't run quite as far, I understand, it didn't in fact last very long. It just wasn't man enough for the job. As regards Port Erin, there were lots of plans proposed for Port Erin, and of course, eventually, as you know, it did come to fruition and a breakwater was built, but unfortunately it didn't last very long. The idea was marvellous, and it did afford shelter for mainly fishing vessels, it must be stated, rather than for cargo ships in the Channel, although it was capable of offering shelter to those type of vessels as well.
To what extent has the big tidal range around the coast of the Isle of Man been a factor in making it difficult to provide adequate shelter?
Well, yes, Douglas has a tidal range, a rise and fall on spring tides of about 23 feet. So this means that you have to build a construction high enough to afford sufficient water for the vessel to float at low water, and also for the construction not to be covered at high water. For instance, Victoria Pier, which is built here out into about 25 foot of water, you have 25 foot at low water to start with, and then a rise of some 23 foot. And then on top of that, you also have 10 foot above high water. So you see, it means that there's quite a construction to cater for all level of tides.
I suppose you could say that it was very much a short-sighted policy on the part of successive United Kingdom governments that failed to recognise that the Isle of Man's central position, besides being a danger to shipping, was also a potential refuge.
Oh yes, that is true. The Isle of Man, from its very geographical position in the middle of the Irish Sea, offers shelter to all sorts of shipping. It has done possibly even from Viking times. In fact, the harbour dues reflect this, because a lower charge is charged for vessels calling windbound, as it's known, which is the same thing really. It's vessels seeking shelter.
Visitors to Peel over the years will probably recall that outside the lifeboat house at the root of the breakwater there stood a ship's figurehead, and I asked Peel Town Commissioner and local historian Eddie Leese about its origins.
This was a great attraction to visitors. There was a plaque on the chest of the figurehead indicating that it was the figurehead of the ship St. George, which had been wrecked behind Peel Hill on October the 23rd, 1889. I should think of all the wrecks which the Peel lifeboats have attended in the past, this is the most famous and the best known.
First of all, Eddie, can you tell me a little bit about the St. George? Where was she from, and how did she get into the predicament she was in?
The St. George was a fully rigged Norwegian ship, operating out of Greenwich and was sailing to South America with a cargo of pipes and pit props. It seems that she was attempting to get out through the North Channel, but encountered a very, very severe northwesterly gale which drove her back into the Irish Sea, and she ended up close to the Isle of Man. The storm continued, and although the captain made efforts to get into a safe position, he found himself being driven onto the rocks behind the hill. The Peel lifeboat at that time was the John Monk, in charge of Charlie Kane. They had great difficulty getting out. The lifeboat had to steer out to the north towards Derby and then turn round and come in so as to get towards the back of the hill. The St. George was in a very, very dangerous position, and the Peel lifeboat could not approach very, very closely to it. A rope had to be attached from the St. George to the lifeboat, and the lifeboat men had themselves to be very, very careful and maneuver the ship so that the St. George did not fall on top of them. In this way, they were able to rescue the whole of the crew of the St. George, 24, and there were two very, very special passengers, the captain's wife and the baby. The captain's wife was the first to be rescued. The second to be rescued was the carpenter, who came very, very carefully clutching his carpenter's bag. Inside the bag was the baby for safekeeping. On the beach, the crew were welcomed by many people who had collected there to cheer the courageous action of the lifeboat in venturing out in such a very, very dangerous conditions and carrying out such a successful rescue. Charlie Kane, as the leader of this courageous crew, received personally a medal from the King of Norway, and the Manx government presented each of the members of the crew with a medal and a Bible. Many of these are still to be found in and around Peel. The Bible, well known by its name, the John Monk Bible.
Of Charlie came the cocks, and the thunder of the rocks, and the ship St. George, how he balked the sea-wolf's gorge of its prey. Southward bound from Norway, and the fury and the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in, rolling in, rolling in upon the deadly shore. See, the harbour master stands, cries, "Have you all your hands?" Then as an angel springs with God's breath upon its wings, she went, and the black storm robe was rent with the shout and with the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in, rolling in, rolling in along the deadly shore. And the castle walls were crowned, and no woman lay enswound, but they stood upon the height, straight and stiff to see the fight, for they knew what the pluck of men can do, with the fury and the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in, rolling in, rolling in upon the deadly shore. Lay aboard her, Charlie, lad, lay aboard her, are you mad? With the bumping and the scamper of all this loose deck hamper, and the yards dancing round us here like cards, with the fury and the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in, rolling in, rolling in upon the deadly shore. So Charlie scans the rout, Charlie knows what he's about, keeps his distance, heaves the line. Pay it out there, true and fine, not too much, men. Take in the slack, you Dutchmen. With the fury and the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in, rolling in, rolling in upon the deadly shore. Now the hawser's fast and steady, and the traveller rigged and ready. Says Charlie, what's the lot? 24, then, like a shot. 23s, says Charlie's all I see, with the fury and the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in, rolling in, rolling in upon the deadly shore. Not a soul shall leave the wreck, says Charlie, till on deck you bring the man that's hurt, So they brought him in his shirt. Oh, it's fain I am for you, Charles Kane, with the fury and the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in upon the dead lee shore. And the captain and his wife and a baby, odds my life, such a beauty, such a prize, and the tears in Charlie's eyes, arms of steel, for the honour of old Peel, haul away amid the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in upon the dead lee shore. Sing ho, the seething foam, sing ho, the road for home, and the hulk they've left behind, like a giant stunned and blind, with the loom and the boding of his doom, with the fury and the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in upon the dead lee shore. Here's the child, don't let it fall, says Charlie, nurse it all. Oh, the tossin' of the breasts, oh, the broodin' of soft nests taking turns, as each maid and mother yearns for the babe that 'scaped the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in upon the dead lee shore. See the rainbow bright and broad. Now all men thank ye God for the marvel and the token and the word that he hath spoken. With thee, O Lord of all that be, we have peace among the din, and the horror and the roar, rolling in upon the dead lee shore. Our national poet, T.E. Brown, capturing the drama, the pathos, and the heroism of the rescue. Northward from Peel, the nature of the coast changes from rock and cliff to shelving sand and shingle, past the Point of Ayr and round Ramsey Bay to Mackle, where the cliffs begin again. I asked Walter Clark, for many years a member of the Ramsey Coast Rescue Company, about wrecks and rescues in the north.
Well, one of the many rescues, or many attempted rescues that took place in and around Ramsey, of course, was a rather tragic affair. That was the tug Conqueror. She set off this time to go across for Liverpool. The weather was very bad and she didn't get very far, and she drifted north just opposite where the present Grand Island is. At that time it was a private house. The weather was so severe that the lifeboat couldn't be launched off the beach. The rocket brigade, as it was called in those days, went down. They couldn't reach her with a rocket, and they let go the small boat on the tug with a young boy in it, and that was blown in onto the beach. And, of course, the people just stood on the beach helplessly watching her disintegrate, and the crew were lost. It was a very tragic affair, but unfortunately it was one of many tragedies at that time.
I suppose the Ulster Queen is probably the most remarkable wreck of the district.
Yes, I would think so. That happened in 1940. And the Ulster Queen, she was quite a big boat. She was a passenger cargo boat. And, of course, we've got the two contrasts in coastline. We have, from the Point of Ayr to Ramsey, it's complete flat sandy beach, but immediately in front of Mackle Head it's high cliffs, rocky outcrops, and a completely different situation from a rescue point of view. And for some obscure reason the Ulster Queen came round Mackle Head, turned sharp left, and lodged herself right up on the rocks, just the Ramsey side of Mackle Lighthouse, completely upright, as if she just simply berthed herself right on the rocks there. Well, the lifeboat was launched, and the lifeboat took off about 60 people. The rocket brigade was called out, and they took off another load of people. She had a mixed cargo, and the cargo had to be taken out of her and brought into Ramsey into store before she could be refloated, which took quite a considerable time. She was also an armed ship, as it was wartime, and they threw a lot of cordite over the side, and of course kids will play about with anything they can find, so we used to make bombs from this cordite. We succeeded in setting the Bruce on fire one day, and the men had to come off the boat and put the fire out. But on top of that, there was quite a mixed cargo which made its way into the warehouse in Ramsey, and the warehouse wasn't terribly secure, so quite a lot of people did benefit from it.
The Ulster Queen, in fact, was refloated, and there was no loss of life either.
No loss of life at all, no. They got her off completely intact, and she was towed off on the big tides and completely saved, and she had quite a distinguished career during the war.
Of course, it's the catalogue of horror and disaster and tragedy whenever we think of these things. I believe you have one or two
stories from your days with the Rocket Brigade.
Yes, well, unfortunately, a lot of these rescue attempts do end in tragedy. There was one instance, I think this happened about 1937. A trawler went in on the Bulgham, and one of the local farmers actually reached her with a balk of timber and almost begged some of the crew to come off. And of course they wouldn't, and then she slid back and she slipped back. And by the time the rescue company got down there, they'd tied themselves into the rigging, and they were so cold, it was a bitter night, that they couldn't get down to make the lines fast, and the rescue company could do nothing but sit there and watch them drop out of the rigging, gradually drop out until they all went.
And the whole crew?
The whole crew.
When a vessel goes ashore, one of two things happens. Either she's got off and towed away, or wind and weather complete her destruction. However, when a ship sinks offshore, there are interesting relics for Brian King and his diving friends to explore. So I asked him what there was of interest offshore from the island.
Well, to give an example of the way they break up, the back of Langness, for example, where many ships are hit, it's just like a junkyard down very close inshore, and this is because they hit the rocks and the following storms broke them up. But once a ship sinks further offshore, in fairly deep water, and we're talking something in the region of 100 feet, then the chances are she's a steel ship, that she will last a fair number of years. And there are some partially intact or very nearly intact ones around the Isle of Man. The one that comes to mind as a very interesting one is the one at the back of the Bradda Head, which many people go out and fish on. It's only about a mile and a half off Fleshig, is the Thracia, which was a four-masted bark, steel hull. She was being towed by paddle steamer down to Liverpool. She was in ballast, ready for her first voyage, when she capsized in a storm, and the tug was unable to find any sign of it. The tow rope snapped, and there was no sign of it. It was 2 or 3 days later when the body of the captain and his wife were washed ashore, and they were able to identify the captain from his pocket watch, which had an inscription on it. Interesting enough, underwater, it's more or less intact, but it's upside down, and you can see the remains of the masts sticking out of the keel, where they drove literally back up through the bottom.
Is there anything from nearer the present day?
Yes, there's a ship called the Fire King, which is just over a mile north of the Point of Ayr. She went down in 1939 as a result of a collision, and it was a local coaster of about 750 tons. She's partially broken up, there's no superstructure on her, but the hull is more or less intact, but you can drop down into the inside of her. But she's quite big, and over the stern the prop is still there on rudder, and she's built into a sort of a scour pit. That's varying. The bow is in about 60 feet, and the stern goes down to about 100 feet.
I believe that you've actually found the wreck of the old Peveril.
Well, I haven't, but some divers who are on the island have found her. She went down just over at 1900 after a result of a collision, and they have found it in 2 parts, and have recovered 1 or 2 very small artifacts, some plates, or 1 or 2 plates and that sort of thing.
Quite interestingly, I gather that when a wooden ship disintegrates, sometimes her cargo is still to be found.
Yes, the wood, once it's been down for a while, is quickly eaten away, but in Castletown Bay, or just outside Castletown Bay, there is a very unusual reminder of previous days of sail. There is a stack of slates, which were obviously cargo on board a ship, and they are laying on the seabed, more or less stacked as they would be on the ship. They haven't fallen apart, and it's obvious the ship has sunk. The wood has just deteriorated, and we're left with a neat stack of slates, which appear to be Welsh slates. There's also, south of Langness, an old paddle steamer, which may be the Duchess of Lancaster, which went down off the back of Langness, and of which we have the ship's bell. There isn't much of it, the 2 paddle boxes and a few ribs sticking out of the sand, but there in all its glory towards the fore end of the ship is a porcelain toilet.
The waters in the vicinity of the Carp of Man are possibly among the most difficult and dangerous around our coasts, even for modern power-driven vessels. Teddy Corran spent a lifetime at sea in coasters, and was inclined to make light of my question about any bad moments that he'd experienced in the Sound.
Well, I've had a few, I suppose. Harry isn't the odd one, straight enough, that come into mine, and that, of course, virtually would be through dark weather, as we were talking about fog and one thing and another, because bound to Peel, it is virtually a sort of a shortcut if we could possibly manage it. But we have had an odd one that we thought, well, we'd better get out of here or it's going to be disaster, that sort of thing.
Just tell us about one of those now, Teddy.
Well, there's one occasion I can remember very well in the Benny, in the steamboat Benny, I'm talking about. We were bound to Peel one bad day, a Saturday it was, and, it's going in on a Saturday morning, we're all hurry up, get there and get the tide and knock off. But we got very dark southwesterly wind and blowing hard, and first thing we picked up, we coming in, we were going for the sound, sure enough. We picked up a Spanish head. Well, it was raining heavy and dark. So we thought, well, we got Spanish Head now, we knew where we were now, right enough, we'd go away for the sound. But no, we couldn't make it. The set of a tide was going there, something terrible, and it was coming up to high water, of course, and the tide changes a bit earlier there. But it was going down broadside, there's no case about it, going right down broadside for the Kittle. And so we had about ship now and come out round the calf again, and my word, we were going between the Borough and the Chickens, so there's one sea there, I don't know where it come from. But I know the skipper was with us, the late Arthur Miller. And we were up on the bridge, and Arthur said to me, have a look round there. He said, I think our big funnel ladder is gone. My word, he said, there was a sea came over there, but we got round all right, and off we went. Round the north side of the calf, we were running along gaily then.
The one that got away. But one that didn't get away was the Clan Line's Clan McMaster, which went ashore on the calf in 1923. At 6,500 tons, perhaps the biggest vessel to become a total loss around the island. Loaded with cotton goods and sewing machines for the Far East, she was navigating in dense fog at dead slow speed. Exactly the conditions, as Teddy Corran confirmed, in which a vessel is most at risk in an area of such strong tides.
Oh yes, it is. There's no mistake about that, because you've got 3 or 4 tideways, all of which are very strong, down from the Sound, going south, or even going north, or round the Borough, through the Chicken Sound, and all. It's all a virtually matter of tideways, and to be in the like of fog or anything like that is very touchy sort of an area to be in.
Now, the Clan McMaster in this photograph that you showed me looks as though she's blocking up pretty well the whole channel between the Sound and the Thusla.
Yes, that's true, she is, yes. I have heard it said that had she been slightly more to port, she may have skipped in through between the Thusla and the calf, but even then I would think that she would have ran foul of the clets, because they are standing out quite a bit, and to come out through the blind Sound, I don't think there would have been much chance of her. And I mean to say, it's very rough, rocky area there too. She wouldn't stand no chance. Anything that's likely to go on there anywhere. Of course, they've had it. I'm not saying she would be going on at any speed, but she just ran up with her bow up on the rocks, as you can see by the photograph. Her bow is well virtually out of the water, but that, of course, be accounted with a stern going down. I suppose her back was broke, really.
So you would have said then that if she'd managed to head into the main Sound itself, she'd have got through unharmed?
Well, I dare say she would, if she'd have got in between the Kittle and the Thusla, and, well, mind you, I don't know what draft she would have been, right enough, what is she, but she would have stood a bit of a clearance, I think, it's just possible that she may have scraped through.
Now, she was never got off, but there's nothing to see nowadays. She must have broken up very quickly.
Well, yes, she did. She will break up. I don't know how long it took or what really happened to her after. I know some of the cargo was salvaged out of her, what cargo was possible to get out, but as for the ship itself, I don't really know what happened with her. She was broken up and taken for scrap or what, but there are parts of her yet, I believe. Skin divers reckon that there's boilers of it is still down there, but as for anything else, well, I wouldn't like to say,
Do you remember as a young fella seeing her there?
Yes, I remember it all right, I know. It was a Sunday morning when she went there, when we got the word anyway. I remember a crowd of us going, I was only young at the time, I was about 11, going up to what's now Cronker Watch and having a look down. The fog had cleared that time, and could see her there and all the activity connected with it, but as far as what went to her, whether there was lifeboats or anything, but of course the weather was calm.
Now, you were mentioning that the contents found their way ashore.
Yes, I have heard that they have done, yes. You know, there's plenty of silk cloths going about, sewing machines and what have you. They said that there was quite a bit. I don't know, every house had a sewing machine, but I don't really know whether they were in parts or packages or what they were, but it has been rumoured that they had. I suppose there was things taken from her anyway.
Gifts from the sea, just like that rather insecure warehouse that Walter Clark mentioned earlier. Sometimes the greed of those scavenging on a wreck had its ludicrous side.
A very good photo of the wrecked steamer has been obtained by Mr. Moore. The steamer is almost broken up, and all hopes of saving her have long disappeared. The cargo included 70 tons of porter. Douglas butchers went to the wreck and paid 10 shillings each for the dead cattle, and flayed them on the spot. A few were fit for meat. Many disgraceful scenes were to be witnessed at Langness on Sunday, nor were the scenes confined to this place alone. At Port Sodrick, it is stated that several barrels of porter were washed ashore. The ends of the barrels were immediately knocked in, and a scene of the greatest debauchery took place, visitors as well as boatmen drinking the stolen liquor. At Langness, the scenes were far worse. Large numbers of people were to be seen in different groups, like eagles over the dead carcass. Amongst them were soldiers and sailors, labourers, and even women, boys and children. The soldiers drinking out of their hats, and others out of their boots and anything that would hold. One man was even found dead in one of the gullies, having imbibed too large a quantity of porter. Large quantities of fish were also to be seen, poisoned by the strong drink.
But when the brig Lily, outward bound from Liverpool for West Africa with a cargo of rum, cotton goods, guns and gunpowder, went ashore on Kitterland in a gale a couple of days after Christmas in 1852, the scene was set for tragedy of the grimmest kind. Several of the crew, including the carpenter, were lost when the ship struck, and the captain was drowned trying to swim for safety. The remainder were rescued, however, and as the weather moderated, the Lily, substantially intact, was seen to be high and dry, awaiting either the looters or the salvors.
The ship was seen on Kitterland, and Mr. Lace of Port St. Mary, who was the Lloyd's agent, made preparations for saving the cargo, and he enlisted the help of the local men in going down to get the cargo. He started collecting people together about 4 a.m. on the Tuesday morning and made his way to Kitterland. At about 8 a.m. they got down there. There was a small boat which had been brought to from Port St. Mary, and it ferried the men across. When they arrived there, they did notice some smoke coming out of one of the hatches, and in order to try and find out what was happening, one of the carpenters cut a hole in the deck. Perhaps it was the influx of air through this hatch which allowed the air in, and thus the oxygen, to allow combustion to take place. But certainly as a result of that, at that moment, a terrific explosion took place, and by that I mean terrific. It was loud enough to be heard all around the south of the island. To Castletown, the miners in Ballacorkish mine thought an underground explosion had taken place and rushed to the surface. There were parts of bodies reputedly found all around the south of the island, although that's never been substantiated, and 2 small cannon were hung in the George Hotel for some time afterwards, reputedly being found on Pool Vash, all bent and twisted after being blown from the wreck of the brig Lily. That takes some believing, but that's a legend.
Let's be clear about this, Brian. This wasn't unofficial scavenging. This was an official party attempting to secure the cargo.
Yes, this was all done officially with Mr. Lace, as we said before, who was the Lloyd's agent. It seems from later information that there may have been some unofficial salvaging going on earlier on, and this may have led to the explosion. It has been found later on in a newspaper reference that a gentleman in America made a deathbed confession to the fact that he and 3 others had been working on the wreck earlier on, had left a lit candle there. They had seen the Lloyd's agent with all the men coming down and had fled the ship very quickly, and remembered the lit candle but were too late to go back. and shortly afterwards the explosion occurred.
Not a direct result of the stress of weather, but to have such a tragedy happen in a small place like Port St Mary must have left a vast impression.
It was a major blow to Port St Mary, with 25 of the men coming from there. 2 came from the Howe and 2 from Castletown, while leaving 22 widows and 72 orphans.
And the memorial stone to those whose lives ended so violently can still be seen in Rushen churchyard. But not all who saw vessels pounding on the rocks were greedy for salvage. It was a story of pure heroism which ensued when the schooner Jeanne St Charles, on passage from Brittany to Londonderry, was hurled onto the Thusler Rock in the middle of the Sound. Valerie Cottle takes up the tale.
The two most notable aspects of the wreck of the Jeanne St Charles, I think, were the very sad loss of the 2 youngest members of the crew, and the quite extraordinary heroism displayed by men from Port St Mary. The ship was under the command of Captain Joseph Jégoux, who was a very experienced seaman, and he had 5 other crewmen with him, a mate, 2 adult crewmen, and these 2 young boys, his brother Yves, and another young boy, Francois Arve, who came from the same area. They had quite a lot of problems, really, throughout the journey. They set out from Pontrieux, but couldn't leave the mouth of the river Trieux for 2 days. We forget nowadays how much sailing ships, obviously, were governed by the weather. They waited 2 days for a favourable wind to take them around the channel. And then as they came up through the Irish Sea, by about the 4th or 5th day of the journey, which in itself should only have taken 5 days, they ran into very stormy conditions and the boat was damaged. They took in a heavy sea which smashed the hatch over the accommodation area, and that was flooded. A couple of days later the mizzen boom broke, and then as they came up towards the Isle of Man, this was fairly late at night, they saw the lights on the Calf of Man. It was stormy. The captain decided to luff up and drop anchor, but he did so only a few hundred feet from the shore. They dropped the 2 bow anchors and were held really not much more than ship's length from the cliffs, but the ship was being washed over from stem to stern by the sea, and by the early hours of the morning both the anchor chains gave way, and the ship then was drifting quite helplessly along the coast of the Calf of Man. They eventually dropped their 1 remaining anchor in the narrow channel which separates the main Isle of Man from the Calf, but this held only long enough for them to be able to launch a long boat and for the 6 men to get into it. The captain managed to take some of the ship's papers with him and a few personal belongings, but the schooner herself had to be abandoned. The wind and the currents were so strong that they didn't even have time to ship their oars before both the longboat and the Jeanne St Charles herself were swept onto the Thusler Rock. The waves then washed over them. The first wave took away every oar from the longboat, and the second turned it over completely, leaving the 6 crewmen clinging onto the bare rocks. The 2 young boys obviously didn't have strength to hold on, and they were very quickly swept away and drowned. And then began a terrible ordeal for the remaining 4 men, who were left clinging to the rocks, and in fact they continued to cling to them in these stormy conditions for more than 3 hours, with the waves breaking over them and the wind ripping at their clothes. Their predicament had been noticed as the dawn came up from the land, and the alarm was raised in Port St Mary, which of course was a couple of miles distant, and somebody had to run there. The storm was still so violent that there was no question of them setting out in a boat from Port St Mary to rescue the Frenchmen. So what they did was something quite extraordinary. They set out to carry a hefty rowing boat all the way from Port St Mary up the Howe, which, as you know, is very steep, and over Craignish and down to the Sound to launch it from there. This first boat was carried and carried by its crew of 5 men. They got it down to the Sound, they launched it, but the current was so violent that they were swept right past the Thusler Rock with no chance of rescuing the Frenchmen, and to save their own lives they had to land on the Calf. This experiment was then tried a second time. A second boat was carried up from Port St Mary. They launched their boat into this maelstrom of a sea, still hearing the cries of the Frenchmen from the Thursley Rock, and by some miraculous chance they managed to snatch all 4 men from the rock as they were swept past, and in turn they were then all carried over to the Calf.
Pure heroism indeed. Next time you visit the Sound, particularly if it's a stormy day on a high spring tide, have a look at the cross in the cafe car park, the memorial to this rescue. Then look out at those turbulent waters and marvel with T.E. Brown at what the pluck of men can do.
This program is dedicated in appreciation and gratitude to the organizations and services whose work makes our coastline safer. The men of the Lighthouse Service, the crews and shoreside support of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, and the officers and volunteers of Her Majesty's Coast Guard and Coast Rescue Units. Island of Shipwrecks was researched, produced and presented by Ian Cottier.